Well, welcome everyone to session 3 of the Resilience Masterclass series. My name is Stephen Mullen and I'm your facilitator for today. So, how would you define community resilience and how can the voluntary and charity sectors contribute in a response phase of a crisis? Now, most people would agree that having more volunteers to assist in the response phase is a great asset. But if we have a sudden surge in numbers, how do we begin to process, deploy, and manage these volunteers? And if you're a charity, you may be at risk of loss of income due to the economic downturn in a crisis. How can you maintain business as usual to your most vulnerable beneficiaries whilst providing support to those impacted by new issues created by a crisis? Well, these are some of the dilemmas we'll be considering in today's session as we're joined by Professor Duncan Shaw and Andrew Beeforth, OBE. Now, to make these sessions as interactive as possible, we do invite you to send any questions you have in advance to our panel, or for those of you who are joining us live, you can comment at any time using the live chat feature at the bottom of this page on which this video is playing. And our presenters will address these. If we can't do it in the live session due to the numbers of questions that we receive, we will be providing a follow-up to you to answer your questions, so please do send us your comments and questions. Finally, the views and opinions of the presenters are not necessarily the views and opinions of the University of Cumbria or any other organisation represented, and links to the relevant resources referred to in these presentations will be provided to you following this event. Now, our first presenter today is Professor Duncan Shaw, and Duncan is Professor of Operations and Critical Systems. He's the head of the Manchester Science Group in Alliance Manchester Business School and participates in the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute, which is based in their School of Arts, Languages and Cultures. Now, Duncan has authored numerous works on volunteering in emergencies, including the International Standard on guidelines for planning the involvement of spontaneous volunteers, which has now been adopted in over 24 countries. Now, for the benefit of our international participants, Duncan shares a bit about this standard. He says, while this new standard is based on extensive research and experience from flood emergencies in the United Kingdom, it also reflects the experience of emergency situations in other parts of the world, including ice storms in Canada, grassland fires in Australia, tsunamis in Japan, and hurricanes in the United States of America, to name a few. This standard recognises the complexity and value of spontaneous volunteers in emergencies and provides a practical guide to help organisations plan their effective involvement. And to frame Duncan's role for our UK participants, he acts as an advisor to the Cabinet Office, local authorities and local resilience forums on volunteering in emergencies. And today, Duncan will be sharing his perspective on involving spontaneous volunteers to help vulnerable people. Over to you, Duncan.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone. So, I work at University of Manchester, and there we've been doing a lot of work around spontaneous volunteers and how they can help vulnerable people. And we've written 2 international standards on the topics, as you'll see on your screen. And I also supported the Cabinet Office in developing national guidance on working with spontaneous volunteers in emergencies. So, spontaneous volunteers are people who want to do good. They're sitting at home, they're watching the television, they're looking at social media, and they see what's going on outside, and they feel sufficiently motivated to go and help. But they're also locked in their houses at the moment, and they are feeling as though they don't have as much control. The freedoms that we normally have been taken away. And so by volunteering, it's one way of taking control back of their lives, getting out the house and going and doing good, as I've said. They may be anxious, But certainly what they want to do is go and help people now. They want to be active, they want to be deployed, they want to do tasks that they want to do. And some of the tasks, as you'll know, are going and doing people's shopping, getting medications, providing a listening ear. But the people who they're helping are vulnerable. These are people who are particularly the most vulnerable in society, and so they've got to be protected. And in the UK, we call those shielded population during COVID, and these are people who we need to help to stay in their homes, and so they need some extra assistance. And the volunteers have been one part of society who have been providing that assistance to them. Some of the volunteers are known to us, so they are trusted partners. So they work for the large organisations, the large voluntary sector organisations that we know, and they have been trained and they may have been DBS checked, and so we know who they are. But then a lot of the volunteers who have come forth recently are unknown. We don't know who they are. They volunteer one day. They haven't been trained, perhaps. They haven't gone through the normal procedure of volunteers, and so we can maybe do a quick DBS check on them. Maybe we can provide them with some supervision, and generally they'll carry out low-risk tasks, so that and they'll be deployed on those sorts of activities. One of the ways in which we try and help these volunteers, these spontaneous volunteers, is by looking at what the risks are associated with the tasks that they might conduct and help to reduce those risks. So things like unsupervised contact with vulnerable people is something that we would not normally put a spontaneous volunteer and ask them to do. But we tell them, don't go into vulnerable people's houses. We make sure that they've been briefed, that they've been instructed as to what to do, and we really try and protect them and the vulnerable person as much as possible. Some of the volunteers will be asked to do driving activities, and so they'll be asked to confirm they've got driving licence, insurance, MOTs, and so forth. But there's a whole range of different activities that the volunteers can do. One of the particular challenges is to think about the reputation to the volunteer brand and to the organisations that they are supporting. And so we need to think and put in place instructions and guidelines for the volunteers so that they know what they can do and perhaps what they can't do. They will know how to use information, they'll know how to represent the organisation, and they'll be very aware as to how they could avoid causing harm to themselves, to vulnerable people, as I've said, by not going inside people's houses and by not going beyond the terms of their tasking. We've seen a huge number of volunteers come forth recently through the NHS Emergency Responder Programme, and 750,000 volunteers were registered for that. About 600,000 were eventually accepted onto the programme. Them, in addition to the volunteers that are coming through the local authorities, coming through these voluntary organisations that I mentioned earlier, and the Facebook groups, and there's so many volunteers in this system at the moment. It's fabulous to see because there's lots of activity going on there, lots of people wanting to help. And the important thing is trying to manage that and trying to coordinate all that activity so that the tasking and the risks associated with volunteers are minimised and are managed as closely as possible. So part of that is asking the volunteers to follow a code of conduct. That makes sure that the volunteers know that they've been asked to identify a task that they want to do and that they only do that task, that they've had that instruction, that they've got ID that's visible, that they have the PPE if that's necessary for the tasks they're doing, and then some other conduct advice that we can give to them. And this advice is typically given by the tasking authority, so whether that's a voluntary organisation, whether it's the NHS, whether it's the local authorities, but it's trying to make sure that the volunteers know what they can do and what they can't do or shouldn't do. However, there's also this very important collection of people who are managing the volunteers, and some of them are very experienced volunteer managers, and they work for voluntary sector organisations where they have been managing volunteers for a substantial period of time, and they have the processes in place to do so. For some, particularly the local authority, where they've just created perhaps a new volunteering arm to their activities. It may be staff that have been redeployed from other activities, from other jobs within the local authority. And so they come and they provide support to the processes that the volunteers are delivering. And so these are general guidelines for all staff who are working with volunteers. And first is to make sure that they understand that we have a duty of care to volunteers. That means that the volunteers need to have a very clearly defined role, and the risk assessment's done, there's insurance there, the volunteers know what they're being asked to do, and that once that volunteering task has been completed by the volunteers, then you check on the volunteers to make sure that their welfare is still in good order, and if they need any further support, then they have particular signposts and they know where to get that additional support. Because again, these volunteers might not be familiar with the type of tasks and the type of people that they're interacting with, and so it's important to make sure that they are well when they finish their task. There's also some guidelines around processes that the managers for volunteers might want to follow. So there's a registration and an acceptance process. So for example, not all the volunteers who want to support vulnerable people might be suitable. They might be showing signs of COVID. They might have other conditions that would suggest that at this point they are not able to volunteer, but maybe it's something they could do a bit later. There's some processes outlined that again can help to give managers comfort of knowing when they can decline an offer of help and when they can accept an offer of help, and it's been very much based on a risk analysis. Also looking and thinking about the volunteers' capacity and thinking about what tasks the volunteers want to do and whether they're able to do that. And as I said here previously about issuing PPE, issuing ID, making sure that the vulnerable people are going to be served well by the volunteers because the volunteers are well prepared for delivering the tasks that they're being asked to deliver. Another part of the guidelines is around management structure, so making sure that there is resilience in that structure, making sure that the vulnerable people and the volunteers have somebody to turn to if they need any additional support. So typically that's a call centre where the volunteers will be able to phone up and ask for some support if they're presented with a challenge that they're not quite sure how to address. Or indeed if the vulnerable person has some feedback on the system that they've experienced and want to provide that back to the tasking organisation. And as I said previously, it's really important that these different organisations have an element of management in there so that these managers can ensure good relations across the different organisations that are all working in this area at the moment, and trying to make sure that all the volunteers are working productively, that they're making sure that they're delivering a very helpful and beneficial service for the vulnerable people. One of the challenges that we've had in the last few weeks is that when we were developing this guideline and when we were developing the Cabinet Office guidelines, we were thinking of small numbers of volunteers, so maybe 100, maybe 500. But we have been seeing a fantastic number of volunteers presenting, and I'm hearing many local authorities have 3,000 volunteers, for example. And so we've been really thinking about how we can have a system of registration and of support that's proportionate, but it's also one that's scalable, so that volunteers are not put in positions of risk, but nor are vulnerable people. And so really looking to see which part of this system is struggling with the numbers of volunteers who are presenting, as well as the number of vulnerable people who need support. And so we've been seeing a lot of vulnerable people who have been needing support far more than we perhaps would normally see. And so we've just got to make sure that the systems that we have in place are both scalable and they're proportionate to the risks that we're seeing. One of the big challenges that we're thinking at the moment is around how do we sustain this volunteering effort. So it almost feels like within the tasking we're almost at business as usual, where the vulnerable people are having their food parcels delivered, they're getting medicines delivered, they're having phone calls and befriending calls if that is what they're requesting. And so that system seems to be well in place now. But lots of the volunteers are being tasked, and we're not seeing a diminishing in workforce. Certainly, it was something at the very beginning of COVID that we were concerned about. Well, what happens if we see a 50-60% drop in our staff? And that means that local authority staff are not able to provide that management of the volunteers, or perhaps the voluntary sector organisations are also not able to see not able to have that number of managers working there. So really being concerned about staff workforce and making sure that they're well and able to support. Also thinking about the volunteer base, because obviously the volunteers may get ill, they may decide to stop volunteering, they may get burned out, they may be frustrated about not being deployed, and so decide to stop the volunteering effort. And so what actually happens if the number of volunteers that we thought we might get is actually much less? So the 3,000 volunteers I mentioned earlier, when you actually try to task them, they're not there. We haven't seen that as a challenge. Really what we're seeing far more is that we have perhaps a lower demand for services than we expected and a higher supply of volunteers, which is a very good position to be in, but it also means that we've got to pay close attention to the support of the volunteers and keeping them interested in volunteering and making them aware that their time is still really important to us, but we're just not able to task them at the moment because of demand. But I'll come on to that a little bit later as to how else we can support and deploy volunteers. One thing that we have begun to see is that where the perception of the risk rises, then volunteers can begin to get understandably more nervous. So, for example, partway through the response, we saw that some of the volunteers were beginning to drop out. They were beginning to say, no thank you, we don't want to participate, because they were being asked to stand in supermarket queues and they felt vulnerable. They felt that they were surrounded by people who they were putting themselves in a position of risk because they could catch the virus. What we haven't seen in the UK as much as perhaps in other countries is, this is an example from Italy, is where there's begun to be some aggression towards volunteers, is that the community have looked at volunteers and said, well, you're going out and going close to people who have COVID and you could bring it back into our community. And so they've been looking at volunteers who've been breaking the movement restrictions, and they've been shouting at them and telling them to go back home and to get back into their houses because they've been breaking those restrictions. So that aggression we haven't seen in the UK, largely because of the media campaigns and the information that's been disseminated through that. Communication has been absolutely essential. Communication both in calling for volunteers as well as celebrating the volunteers. And it will also be important as to when that volunteer effort begins to get closed down, because the requirement goes away. I should say that requirement looks like it's going to stay around for quite some time, because the shielded population will need to be shielded for that amount of time. But one thing that's absolutely critical is the thanking of volunteers. They have come, they've provided their help and done so willingly. Assessing the impact of volunteers is something that's very important as well, is understanding where these good stories are, understanding where they've made a difference and the amount of support that they've provided to the vulnerable people. And I talked earlier about some of the volunteers haven't yet been deployed, and so there's a frustration building. And what we've been encouraging local authorities to do is think about a whole range of tasks that volunteers could be deployed for. And some tasks you might need those known volunteers, as I called them at the beginning, to go and do those activities. Things like shopping prescriptions and so on. And for those, you need to have people who are DBS checked and so forth. And they need to work independently. But there's a whole lot of volunteers who could do tasks that are equally as important but might not want to go through the DBS process and so forth. And they can provide all sorts of additional support. So really encouraging local authorities, encouraging voluntary sector organisations to think very, very broadly about where can volunteers be productively and importantly tasked to go and help society to recover from the effects of COVID. One of the activities that we've perhaps been less successful in is the very last one on this list of the food chain, the picking fruit and so on. DEFRA have called for volunteers and has found it difficult because of the conditions that they've put on the volunteers in terms of the sort of conditions that they've got to spend weeks away from family and so on. But there are a whole range of tasks beyond shopping, prescriptions and befriending that volunteers can help with. And so really encouraging people to think very broadly about the sorts of activities that volunteers might be able to support. We see a whole lot of very interesting issues that have emerged during this. Is the number of volunteers that have emerged are extraordinary. And we've seen local authorities developing different ways of handling the operations. But what we've been saying to local authorities is, whilst you're developing your own volunteer arm, perhaps you need to think about beginning to hand that activity over to the voluntary sector. They're the people who are best placed to continue that effort. And whilst we understand that that needed to be a very quick emergency response, which is why the local authorities took over that task, the continuing development, the continuing operation that needs to take place is one that can be performed by the voluntary sector. And so commissioning the voluntary sector to deploy volunteers and to conduct this business as usual activity is something that we're really trying to encourage the UK to turn its attention. And so we're beginning to think about the recovery, but more the renewal of the voluntary sector. So we're thinking about what tasks can the shielded group be supported by volunteers, thinking about this breadth of tasks as I've talked about, thinking about what training needs to be given to volunteers for that, thinking about this whole cadre of volunteers and motivating them to take different tasks, different roles as their life becomes more busy because they begin to leave their house. So we're really needing to think about this voluntary community that's been built and thinking about how that transitions into the recovery and into the renewal process that we're going to be seeing through the UK. We're thinking about how charities and how the voluntary sector can become even more involved, and think about how local authorities can hand over those activities to the voluntary sector, being aware that this needs to start now, needs to start in a commissioning way so that the voluntary sector is there and is able to provide very strong support on an ongoing basis. Some of the other things we've been doing at Manchester is producing a weekly briefing on COVID-19. This is for local authorities, for voluntary sector organisations, and for them to think about some of the lessons from across the world. And I'd really encourage you to register at the website that's on the screen now. And again, these are a whole series of lessons about COVID and about how the voluntary sector and the local authorities can respond to this challenge. I'd like to thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'll hand back to Stephen.
Thank you, Duncan. Now, if you've got any questions or comments for Duncan, please use the comments box below to submit them now. Our second presenter today is Andrew Beeforth. Andrew has led the charity Cumbria Community Foundation since its creation in 1999, and this charity has made significant contributions to the lives of many of the disadvantaged people in our county. In its first 20 years, more than 44 million was distributed, along with the design and delivery of 4 major disaster appeals, including raising over £10 million to help people affected by the 2015 floods. Isn't that amazing? And the creation of more than 100 grant-making funds on behalf of individuals, families, businesses and charitable trusts. In 2011, Andrew was made an OBE for services to the voluntary sector, and due to his significant experience in disaster response, he actually contributed to the development of the National Emergencies Trust, for which he is a trustee today. Now, for the benefit of our international participants, Andrew is a fellow of the Transatlantic Community Foundation Fellowship and ambassador for the Transatlantic Community Foundation Network. And for some of our local participants, Andrew is known for getting his sleeves rolled up and is often seen on the front line of a response and championing the cause of the vulnerable in our community in the media. So I'll hand over to Andy now, who will be sharing his perspective with us on charity and community response to crisis.
Hello, my name's Andy Beeforth and I'm the Chief Executive of the Cumbria Community Foundation. And it's a real pleasure today to have the opportunity to sort of talk through with you the experience that my organisation has had responding to disasters in Cumbria since 2001 and to actually share with you the changes that have happened over time, how communities have responded, how the charity sector has responded, and how those two parts of our communities have actually interacted with local authorities, and most importantly, how I think we've become a more resilient and supportive community. I think you'll learn that we're very fortunate that over time we have learned, and Cumbria has become an example of best practice in terms of disaster response. But through sharing stories and case studies, you'll actually see what that means in practice. So I'm talking to you today both as the Chief Executive of the Cumbria Community Foundation, but also a founder and board member for the National Emergencies Trust. And it's probably helpful to say a little bit about Cumbria Community Foundations, about community foundations generally, but also the work of the National Emergencies Trust. So the Cumbria Community Foundation is part of a worldwide movement of community foundations, and we're grant makers into our local communities. We also promote philanthropy, and we're only able to give the grants we do by building partnerships with local families, local businesses, and other organisations who give through us. And our normal work is to address disadvantage in our communities. We build significant endowed funds and work with other partners to address ongoing community need. Disaster response is only something that we do, I guess you could jokingly say, on top of the day job. Now, the National Emergencies Trust, of which I'm a board member, was launched in November 2019 by the Duke of Cambridge and was created to coordinate both fundraising and grant making in response to national disasters. And I'll say more about that later on in the talk. This slide is taken from 2001. It's a very moving picture, a plume of smoke rising above burning carcasses, animals that have been destroyed because of the foot and mouth outbreak. Now, Cumbria had 40% of the UK cases, and our farming industry was devastated, also our tourism industry as well. And this is really the contemporary starting point for Cumbria's learning on disaster response. My own organisation launched an appeal, and we raised over £2 million to help people, and those grants were used, a small amount, or a relatively small amount, for hardship grants, a larger proportion going to groups and organisations, many providing practical support to people affected, but also many organisations' ability to fundraise was stopped, and we helped with those grants as well. But I think what was most telling in 2001 was it wasn't until we had the army come in, we had a foot and mouth task force, but really our local authorities were not organised. The charity sector wasn't organised. My own organisation was very small at the time, and it actually took us a month in which to mobilise ourselves and actually decide to launch an appeal. We're very proud of what was achieved, but I think this will bookend the presentation today in terms of what you'll hear about the Cumbrian experience. Now, I've put this slide together just to show both the history of events in Cumbria over the last 20 years and the Community Foundation's own response. And to make the very simple point that I'm sure none of the audience need to have made is that what we might have considered in the past as exceptional events sadly are no longer that, and the frequency of them, certainly in Cumbria, has been far greater than any of us would have wished. So I put this slide together just to describe what the voluntary and community sector looks like in Cumbria in numbers in a normal year, but also the range of services that it's providing, particularly for those of you who are perhaps not involved in the work of local charities or active in your own communities. What's really exceptional, and I guess what's a challenge for us going forward, is with the current pandemic, is the number of informal volunteers, the increase in good neighbourly activity, and also the growing need that will come as a result of the pandemic, both the economic and health outcomes, is just to how can we build on what's already quite a significant resource in the county. I'm now going to describe the response to the 2015 floods. The foundation raised over £10 million, and I think the current response is very much based on the learning from 2009 and 2015, and it was a huge event, by far the most significant flooding incident in the county in 100 years, with huge impact across 4 catchment areas, 5,000 homes and 1,000 businesses. Now, clearly the impact is not on the same scale as the current pandemic, but still a very, very significant event. And in terms of the role of philanthropy, my own organisation raised £2.3 million, and a significant proportion of that went in grants to individuals to support households get back on their feet. Significant issues for people who were not insured, but also a lot of knock-on issues for people who were either underinsured or where insurance simply didn't cover all of the costs. We also spent significant funds supporting individual households with building additional resilience measures, practical physical infrastructure measures into either individual homes or groups of homes, but also most importantly, not most importantly, but importantly, £2.6 million into 170 groups. Now, what we did in 2015, and which we're looking to replicate as far as we can in 2020, is we actually created, through the resilience structures, a template for what services did we want to see in each community. So that might be support for the elderly, it might be benefits advice, it might be practical emotional support, it might be mental health support, and through conversations in each locality and with the Community Foundation's own structure of grant making, we actually proactively sought partners to fill spaces, not just for the immediate response, but as we know that much of the impact and much of the need arising from these incidents exists for months, and for some of the more vulnerable families, absolutely years. I think the other thing it's important to say in terms of learning, the last bullet on this slide is we did actually, with, as I mentioned, the history of incidents in Cumbria, the Community Foundation chose to create a standing disaster fund, particularly for when there were incidents that weren't of sufficient prominence in the public eye to be able to launch an appeal, but for which need in the community still existed. So this slide just builds on the previous one in terms of describing the grant making in response to the 2015 floods. And I think the points I'd like to draw out are more to do with the investment that was made, that's currently the benefits of which are being reaped now. So that's grants into recovery organisations that still exist on the ground, but also funding for the support of a community resilience coordinator post within the Council for Voluntary Service. And some of you in Cumbria will know Carolyn Otley very well, and she holds that post. Carolyn's worked in that role since the 2015 floods, and is currently chairing the Community Resilience Group. I'm not aware of a similar role across the country, but it's certainly been fundamental in being a pivot between the statutory sector and community organisations, and we're certainly very proud of being able to support that key role. Now, this is a list of a specific type of group that was supported in the 2015 appeal, but they're actually as relevant now in that many of them are actually at the backbone of the current COVID-19 response. So Cumbria has almost uniquely built its community resilience and response to COVID-19 around the capacity within communities. So we have local authorities managing distribution hubs, but actually the coordination on the ground is by these community level organisations. I can point at ones like Keswick and Appleby that were created and existed to respond to future flooding incidents, but are actually now working specifically on the pandemic response. Now, at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about that I'd describe how the community sector and the charity sector actually interfaced with and worked with the public sector. And this diagram is the structure for recovery from the 2015 floods, and we have something very similar. My next slide will touch on the 2020 pandemic structure. But what's really important is to see that difficult to see, but in green highlighted where the community foundation was actually represented. We sat on the strategic coordination group as well as the community recovery group and the 4 district community recovery groups, and they all had significant community representation on certainly the recovery groups, enabling the statutory sectors to work well with, but also harness the capacity within the community sector. Now, apologies if you can't actually follow or read this this slide. It's just a screenshot from my laptop, but this is the equivalent recovery infrastructure for 2020, complicated significantly by the addition of links into the health sector. But essentially, it's built on the same model as 2015, with just every district in the county being supported with its own local recovery group, interfacing between the public sector and the community sector. Now, I'd just like to share some examples of key organisations that have been part of the response and resilience effort, and certainly our mountain rescue and search organisations have been at the heart of that. They, over time, have significantly built their swift water rescue capability, and the Community Foundation has been a key funder of that. But also, as we look to have growing numbers of people coming to the fells as lockdowns released, I already know that the mountain rescue teams are ready to respond to any incidents as a result. Now, I've included the Cumbria Farmer Network as an example of community resilience that people might not at first think was at the forefront of their minds. But farmers in Cumbria face significant challenges, and this organisation was born out of the 2001 foot and mouth outbreak, and they exist to support farmers through mutual aid and organisation. And in response to the 2020 pandemic, have got a scheme that enables farmers who are unable because of illness to work to have their farms and their livestock looked after. This network's also a significant partner for the Community Foundation, and they acted as an agent for us when we raised funds and distributed them in response to hardship caused by Storm Emma. So we're now able to come up to absolutely the current day and look at the response in Cumbria to the COVID-19 pandemic. I've made reference to building on lessons learnt and working through organisations that have responded or were born out of previous incidents. And I think it's really important to say that we've learnt over time. I convened a meeting of charities after the 2005 floods in Carlisle, asking them all to step up, see if they'd work together and share their volunteers. And back in 2005, at least 50% of the organisations in the room turned around and said, we don't do disasters. Now in 2005 I said, well, yesterday we didn't do disasters, but today we do. And I think looking at Cumbria in 2020, very sadly our experience is such that we do know that we have to respond to disasters, and we have the capability and the capacity to do that. I think also I touched on it taking 4 weeks to launch the first 2001 foot and mouth appeal. 2015 appeal, I think, was launched in about 6 hours, and the similar timescale for this COVID Community-19 Response Fund by the Cumbria Community Foundation. And although I don't have slides to describe it, what has been absolutely remarkable is the way that both the statutory sector has linked in with the growth in new neighbourhood level groups. And for my organisation, it's the first time we've seen organisations, new organisations on almost every street and every community, and linked by a single phone referral system, and with hubs manned by staff from both district and county councils, but also the business sector. It's been a truly astounding response. Linked in responses around how we support our health sector, the provision of PPE also. But a real reason to celebrate at a time of real hardship, but also differences for us at the Community Foundation. In the past, we've launched appeals at times where we've been the only major fundraising appeal. We've done surveys this year with the CVS and through the Community Resilience Group, and we know that many of our charities can no longer fundraise. Some are at risk of closure. So the situation's very different and sadly more challenging. We have, despite the congestion around fundraising, been able to raise £1.2 million so far. We've also had a private family, an anonymous donation of about £300,000 that's been spent in addition to that £1.2 million that was raised. So we're in a strong position to support the sector, but we're far from home in any respect with this, as we're in the midst of the pandemic. So to summarise our response to date, we've distributed over £700,000 to 98 groups, and the focus of that grant making has been primarily around supporting the immediate response. That's the support to vulnerable people self-isolating, the provision of food and medicine through volunteer deliveries, but also the restructuring of organisation services, particularly around issues which we know will be exacerbated by COVID-19. That's mental health, domestic violence, drugs and alcohol, people with learning disabilities. So some of those grants have gone to organisations to restructure, buy laptops, do training, find alternative ways of providing counselling and support. But we are still in the emergency response phase, and the Community Foundation's developed its own grant making strategy. We expect, until we have a vaccine, significant issues around people continuing to wish to stay living and self-isolating in their own homes, particularly the vulnerable and the elderly, but also the economic hardship impacts of COVID-19 cannot be underestimated. So significant need around just poverty and disadvantage. And again, unlike perhaps previous incidents, we're not talking about short-term interventions. We're talking about the provision of food and supplies and other support services for perhaps 6 months until the economy starts to get back on its feet and people are beginning to be able to get back to work, those who've not been able to have their usual incomes. So the challenge for Cumbria as we look ahead and look to build on the remarkable community and neighbourhood response to COVID-19 is, how do we continue to support our elderly and vulnerable people? How do we capture the energy of community volunteers stepping up for the first time, and for people engaging as volunteers? They probably don't even consider themselves as volunteers. Can we look to build a new way of thinking, a new way of living? I don't sound too idealistic, but I think there's a lot of positives that will come out of this incident. But we also need to be mindful of just how do we do that and capture that energy. And I look forward to suggestions and comments from people inputting into this seminar on this subject. Now, the National Emergencies Trust was created to address the challenge of harnessing the generosity of the British public, particularly with the growth in online living platforms, which meant in response to the Grenfell Tower incident, there were over 10,000 giving pages created with no clear mechanism for distribution of funds. The net has been put in place to do that, and in response to the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, has raised over £70 million and is distributing that through UK community foundations. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you find it useful and informative. I look forward to questions in the Q&A, and if anyone would like to contact me directly at the Community Foundation, please do. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. That concludes our presentations now. And again, if you've got any questions or comments for Andrew or Duncan, please use the comments box to send them to us now. And we're shortly going live at 13:40 to answer your questions live. So do join us for that live Q&A. See you soon.